"Don't touch me, you stupid black girl." The insult didn't echo, it detonated. Silence snapped through Boca like a glass cracking under pressure. Forks froze mid-air. Conversations collapsed. And somewhere between the drip of red wine and the flicker of candlelight, the room forgot how to breathe. It wasn't the first time someone had disrespected her, but it was the first time they did it in front of everyone, in a room full of men who thought they owned the world. Lily didn't move, not right away. The cloth in her hand remained folded. Her wrist, still slightly extended, hovered just inches from Jason Walsh's table. Wine clung to the cuff of his sleeve, deep, red, rich, crawling across the stitching of his $1,000 suit like a quiet revenge. But Jason didn't care about the spill, or the accident, or the tension in the room. He cared that she had touched him, and worse, that she existed in a space where he believed she didn't belong. His eyes didn't show anger. They showed insult, as if proximity to someone like her was a kind of contamination. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His tone had done the damage, precise, sharp, polished, a weapon in a tailored suit. At every other table, people stopped pretending. Phones tilted just slightly. Not all the way, not yet, but enough to capture what had just happened. Some gasped. Most didn't. But everyone felt it. Boca wasn't a normal restaurant. It wasn't where you went for dinner. It was where power whispered through candlelight and deals moved silently between courses. No one came here just to eat. They came to be seen, and tonight they saw everything. Jason adjusted his cuff, more annoyed by the wine than the weight of his own words. He didn't apologize, didn't look at Lily, didn't even pause long enough to consider the moment. But Lily, she didn't leave. She stood tall, still, silent. No flinch, no tears, no apology. Because women like her learn early. When you're born into silence, your dignity can't live in volume. He didn't know her name, didn't care. But he should have, because Lily was not just a waitress. She was the daughter of a teacher who marched in Ferguson and a nurse who worked double shifts through a pandemic. She had finished top of her class at Howard, interned at a venture firm by 21, turned down easier paths to walk into harder rooms, on purpose. Not because she had to serve, but because she wanted to watch, to learn how power behaved when it thought no one important was watching. Jason Walsh had just made that mistake, in front of everyone, and somewhere at that same table someone else noticed. He sat quietly beside Jason, older, sharper, silent. A name not many in the room would recognize, but one that could change everything with a signature. Edward Langston, co-founder of Valoris Capital. And the final approval on the $4.5 billion merger Jason had been chasing for 7 months. Jason never introduced him, never thanked him, barely looked at him. But Edward had seen it all. The insult, the silence that followed, the strength of a woman who refused to be erased. Lily stepped back, calm, controlled. "Please enjoy the rest of your evening," she said softly. Then she turned and walked away. In the kitchen, the noise of orders and dishes and ticket printers clashed against her thoughts, but Lily kept her hands steady, her breathing slow. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to reduce her to nothing, but it might be the last time someone got away with it, because this time they heard it. They all heard it. And one of them was the wrong person to make an enemy of. Jason continued talking, as if nothing had happened, as if those 5 words hadn't just set fire to a room full of billionaires, investors, and silent cameras. He leaned into his chair, cut into his filet mignon, and resumed a half-hearted joke about aggressive growth and aggressive women, expecting the table to laugh. No one did. Not Edward Langston, not the assistants, not even his own legal advisor, who now sat perfectly still, glancing between his untouched plate and the man who had just made everything harder. Jason didn't notice, because men like Jason never notice until it's too late. A few feet away, Lily stood at the service station, still, focused, composed. She was folding napkins, but her mind was wide open, listening to every second of silence that followed her exit. She didn't need to look back to know what was happening, because it always followed the same pattern: insult, dismissal, silence, then discomfort. Not because of guilt, but because someone dared not to cry when expected to. The maître d' approached her quietly. "You okay?" Lily nodded once. "I'm fine." He hesitated. "If you want to step out—" "I'm fine," she repeated. Not colder, not louder, just final, because stepping away would make it look like she had broken, and she hadn't. Back at table 1, Jason checked his watch. "Can we talk numbers?" he said casually. "Let's lock this down." Edward Langston didn't move, didn't respond. He was still staring at his glass of wine, the same glass he'd set down moments after Jason opened his mouth and revealed who he really was. When he finally spoke, it was quiet. Careful. "I don't like to rush after bad wine." Jason blinked. "Excuse me." Edward smiled faintly, as if it didn't need repeating. Jason let out a forced chuckle, trying to recover the room, but he couldn't feel it. The shift. The gravity had changed, and for the first time all evening, he was no longer the center of it. Lily returned to the floor. Her tray was steady. Her steps were exact. She moved through the dining room like nothing had happened, like the air hadn't cracked open just minutes earlier. But everyone was watching her now. Not with pity, with curiosity. Because she hadn't cried, she hadn't yelled, she hadn't folded. She had done the one thing no one expected. She endured. Jason didn't look at her when she approached the table with dessert. He was too busy trying to win the room back. His words were louder now, his posture more open. He gestured more with his hands, threw out more buzzwords, name-dropped an NBA team he was supposedly advising, trying to cover the silence with noise. But it was too late. The moment had been recorded, not just by the phones, by the room itself. And Jason couldn't talk over what people had already heard. Across the table, Edward turned slightly toward Lily as she placed a delicate glass plate in front of him. She didn't speak, but he did. "Thank you, miss." He paused, inviting the rest. "Lily," she said gently. He nodded. "Thank you, Lily." It was quiet, intentional, and just loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. Jason's hand tightened on his fork. In that pause, everything began to unravel, not outwardly but beneath the surface, because in circles like this, deals don't die with arguments. They die in silence, in subtle shifts, in the moments when power slips, not with a bang but with a glance. Jason didn't know it yet, but he'd already lost. And you... Yes, you watching this right now. You felt it, didn't you? That moment when her silence said more than his shouting ever could. That moment when dignity looked like quiet fire. You've probably seen things like this happen before, maybe to you, maybe to someone you love. And if this kind of story matters to you, don't just watch it and move on. Subscribe. Because stories like this don't go viral by accident. They go viral when people care enough to keep them going. And truthfully, if you're watching and feeling something right now, that means you're part of the reason this story needs to be told. So don't just sit with it, support it, hit subscribe. Then let's keep going, because what happens next? Jason never saw it coming. Jason still thought he could recover. That's what power does when it's never been tested. It assumes the world will bend if it speaks just a little louder. He leaned in, flashing the smile that had closed tech deals and charmed media panels. "Let's not get distracted over drama," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Across the table, Edward said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence had started to turn on Jason. Not because it was loud, but because it was uncomfortable. Even his own VP shifted in his seat, eyes fixed on his untouched creme brulee. One of the junior associates coughed into his napkin, a nervous twitch. The power in the room had shifted, and Jason, once magnetic, once commanding, suddenly looked like a man out of place in his own story. Lily remained on the floor, calm, composed, invisible, but only in the way a flame hides in the wick before the match is struck. She didn't stare, didn't gloat, she didn't have to, because Jason had done all the work for her, and the room was already doing the rest. He tried again, louder this time. "Look, Edward, I came here to talk numbers. Let's stay focused. That little situation's been handled. Handled. The word hung there like a stain. Handled. Like a spill. A delay. A technical glitch. As if a human being could be wrapped in a napkin and tossed aside. Edward finally met his eyes. One day, he said evenly, you'll learn the difference between being handled and being witnessed. Jason blinked. The words didn't register. He opened his mouth, then shut it. His attorney leaned in, whispering something about media monitoring, real-time PR, social sentiment. But Jason waved him off. He was still trying to pretend that his voice had gravity. But in that room, it didn't anymore. Lily moved quietly through the tables. But now every step carried weight. Her colleagues looked at her differently, not out of pity, out of something closer to awe, the kind that comes when someone stands in a fire and doesn't burn. She wasn't new to this. She had spent years being underestimated, spoken over, called girl, miss, sweetie, everything but her name. But this time, it wasn't a whisper in a hallway or a joke told just loud enough to sting. This time it had witnesses, and something told her that someone in that room, maybe more than one, wasn't going to let it slide. Jason couldn't sit still anymore. He stood up abruptly, pretending to straighten his jacket, then walked toward the restroom, muttering something about washing up. He needed air. He needed to regain control, but control wasn't following him tonight. Inside the hallway mirror, his reflection didn't look like the confident CEO he had convinced himself he was. It looked cornered, flushed, off-center, a man whose armor had cracked in front of the one crowd he couldn't afford to lose. He washed his hands, slow, avoided his eyes, rehearsed the next spin. Maybe he'd say it was a misunderstanding, a misquote. Maybe he'd blame the wine. Maybe he could still salvage it, because that's what men like Jason do. They don't fix, they reframe. Back at the table, Edward didn't touch his dessert. He just sat quietly, stirring a spoon through a dish he no longer wanted. His assistant leaned in. "She's still here," he said quietly. Edward nodded. "Good." Meanwhile, Lily was restocking at the side station when the maitre d' returned. "Just a heads up," he said softly. "Mr. Langston asked if you could do final service at their table." She looked up. He shrugged. Said it was a personal request. There was a pause. Then, with the same quiet fire she'd carried all night, she nodded once. "Of course." Jason returned a moment later, composed, brushed, rehearsed, and clueless. Because what he didn't know was that the same woman he tried to erase had just been invited to finish the night. At his table, the final course was being served. Table 1 was quieter now, not from satisfaction, but from pressure. You could feel it rising like steam from untouched plates. Jason sat stiffly, posture perfect, smile fading. The silence had caught up with him, and it had teeth. He tried to pretend otherwise, cracking a weak joke about market volatility. No one responded, and then she returned. Lily, tray in hand, face composed, movements deliberate. The same woman Jason had tried to erase just 30 minutes earlier, now standing before him again, called back by someone more powerful than him. Jason blinked, confused. "What is she doing here?" he muttered under his breath. Edward didn't answer, but his look was enough. Lily began with Edward. "Sir," she said gently, placing the final dish in front of him. "Seared venison with port wine reduction." He nodded. "Thank you, Lily." She moved on, serving the table clockwise, steady, poised, like nothing had happened. But Jason's eyes followed her, like a man watching a fuse being lit. When she reached him last, he stiffened. She set his plate down, with the same quiet precision she'd used for everyone else. No glare, no attitude, no revenge in her tone, just elegance. And that, more than anything, unnerved him. Because what could he do now? Insult her again? Complain? Not tonight, not here, not after everyone saw. Across the table, Edward took a slow sip of water. "You know," he said casually, "I've always believed how a man treats people who can't benefit him says everything." Jason shifted in his seat. Edward didn't look at him when he said it, but he didn't have to. Lily stepped back from the table. She remained close, just enough to be present. And that presence? It unsettled Jason more than the silence ever had, because now she wasn't background noise. She wasn't a server. She was the reminder that this deal, this moment, this room, was no longer his. The air turned thick. Utensils clinked gently. No one filled the silence, because everyone could feel it now. The shift, from dominance to consequence. Jason reached for his glass, hand just barely trembling. He tried to change the subject. "So, Edward, about the final term sheet." But Edward raised a hand. "Later," he said simply. Not rudely, not dismissively. Just, finally. Lily stood still, her hands behind her back, shoulders relaxed. But inside, she felt the full weight of every eye in the room. It wasn't pride she felt. It wasn't triumph. It was control, not over anyone else, but over herself, over her emotions, her power, her voice. Jason leaned toward Edward, lowering his voice. "I don't know what this is," he said through gritted teeth, "but we had a deal." Edward gave him a long, level look. "No, Jason, we had a conversation." Jason's jaw tightened. "Let's be honest," Edward added, setting down his napkin. "The minute you said what you said, you stopped being someone I could trust with a company, let alone a culture." That one word, culture, cut sharper than the rest. Because it wasn't just about business anymore. It was about what Jason had exposed about himself. And now, there was no dressing it up in investor decks or press releases. The truth had come out, not just in what he said, but how little he thought it would cost him. And then came the moment that said more than any of them could. "You'll excuse us, Lily?" She nodded once. "Of course, sir." As she turned to leave, he added quietly, just for her to hear, "You handled yourself with more dignity than half the people I've done business with in 20 years. She gave him a quiet, grateful smile. Not forced, not performative. Real. And then she walked away. Jason sat alone with his silence. The only sound now. The subtle scrape of silverware, and the one truth ringing in his ears. He wasn't winning this room back. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Lily didn't go on break. She could have. She could have gone out back, leaned against the brick wall behind Boca, and let the September night pull the tension out of her chest. But she didn't. Instead, she walked into the service hallway and began folding napkins, one by one, slowly, carefully. Not because the napkins needed folding, but because sometimes the only thing that keeps your hands from shaking is giving them something else to do. She didn't cry. Not because she didn't feel it, but because she'd already cried this moment 100 times before. She just never expected tonight to be the one where everyone else saw it too. Lily wasn't from money. She was from South Shore, raised by a single mother who worked overnight shifts at Mercy Hospital and still packed lunch for her kids every morning. She had grown up watching her mom stand on her feet for 12 hours and come home with a swollen back and a soft smile. She had learned strength not from speeches, but from survival. And when her mom passed away, sudden, cruel, unexpected, Lily didn't grieve out loud. She just took over. She was 18. Her brother Elijah was 9. Born with cerebral palsy, his needs endless, his laugh unforgettable. Scholarships came, a full ride to Howard. She said yes. But dreams don't pay rent, and little brothers can't wait until after finals for therapy. So she worked, and worked, and worked. 2 jobs. Some months, 3. Never complained, never posted about it, never asked anyone for sympathy. Because her mother had taught her, your pain isn't a performance, it's a process. So when people looked at her at Boca and saw a black waitress, she didn't correct them. She let them assume. She let Jason assume. Because when people think you're invisible, they say things they'd never say in a boardroom. And Lily had learned, me too, that was the most honest version of power you'd ever see. Her decision to work at Boca wasn't random. She had turned down internships, safer jobs, even full-time offers. But this place, this room, these men, they were the future, not just of companies, but of systems. And if you wanted to change the system, you had to first learn how it breathes. Lily hadn't come to serve them. She came to study them. And tonight the experiment reached its conclusion. What Jason didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Lily was weeks away from starting her own firm. Langston Equity Group, co-founded by Edward Langston himself, who had quietly been mentoring her since she interned under his senior analyst during undergrad. Not as a diversity token, not as a PR move, but because when Edward saw her work, her vision, and her silence, he recognized it. Not everyone needs to be loud to move a room. Some people just need the right moment. That moment came tonight, when Jason chose to speak without thinking, and the world chose to listen without looking away. Lily folded another napkin. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket, a text from Elijah. "You okay?" She smiled softly. "I'm okay, Eli. I promise." Because she was. For the first time in a long time, she really was. And you're still watching, aren't you? Still here, sitting with this story like it's yours too. Because maybe, in some way, it is. Maybe you've been overlooked. Maybe someone said something to you once that you never forgot. Maybe you've stayed silent when you should have screamed. Or maybe you just know what it feels like to be small in a room full of giants. But Lily isn't small anymore. She's just getting started. So if this story is sitting in your chest right now, if it's reminding you of something real, subscribe. Don't just watch, don't just nod and scroll. Support this kind of storytelling. Because if we don't amplify voices like Lily's, who will? Back in the dining room, Edward Langston stood from the table. He left without dessert. No announcement, no handshake. Just a quiet nod. To Lily. Then he exited the restaurant and stepped into a black sedan waiting at the curb. Jason stayed seated, confused, tight-jawed, still thinking he had time to fix it, still believing the deal was just delayed. But in the private inbox of his attorney, a message had already arrived. Langston Capital has decided not to proceed. No explanation. Just a single line beneath the firm's signature. Character is always part of the valuation. Boca was clearing out. Tables that once hummed with conversations were now littered with half-finished glasses and abandoned napkins. The lights dimmed further, the jazz softened to a whisper. But Lily stayed behind, not because she had to, she could have clocked out, but because some nights don't end just because the clock says they should. She stood by the bar, polishing a wine glass, slowly, not watching the door, not waiting for a moment, just being present. Her shift supervisor approached quietly, offered a nod, and left her alone. Everyone had seen it tonight, not just what Jason said, but what she didn't do, and that stayed with people. She was wiping down a corner table when the maitre d' returned. "Someone's waiting for you in the lounge." She raised an eyebrow. "Who?" He didn't answer, just gave her a soft smile. Lily stepped into the lounge. Edward Langston stood near the fireplace, coat folded over his arm, sipping a small glass of water. He didn't look like a man who had just walked away from a multi-billion-dollar deal. He looked like a man who had finally made peace with a decision. "I hope I'm not keeping you," he said gently. "Not at all," she replied. He nodded toward the chairs. "May I?" She nodded back. They sat in quiet. No tension, no pretense. Just peace. "You know," Edward began, "the first time I saw you, you were 20 years old, standing in the back of a boardroom in Georgetown, taking notes like you were writing a novel." Lily smiled faintly. "I was writing everything down, even the way people paused before they answered." He laughed softly. "I remember. You were quiet then too." "I still am," she said. "But not invisible," he added. "Not tonight." She looked down at her hands. "Did I do the right thing?" Edward tilted his head. "You didn't do anything." She raised an eyebrow. "You stood still, Lily. That's what made it powerful. You let him reveal himself. You didn't stoop. You didn't perform. You just let the room see what you already knew. She breathed in slowly, feeling something loosen in her chest. Something she hadn't known was clenched. "I thought I'd feel better," she admitted. "I don't feel triumphant. I just feel tired." Edward nodded. "Because silence costs energy. Grace costs more than anger. Anyone can yell, but standing still, that's something else." She looked at him, grateful, seen. It wasn't validation she needed. It was understanding, and he gave it, without asking for anything back. "I wasn't sure you'd walk away from the deal," she said. Edward took a long sip of water before replying. "I didn't." She looked confused. He smiled. "I didn't walk away because of the insult. I walked away because of who he became after it. A man can make a mistake, but who he is after the mistake tells you everything." She nodded slowly. That made sense. That felt true. "You're still moving forward with the fund?" "Langston Equity. We go live in 3 weeks. You ready?" "Not at all," she said honestly. "But I'm not backing down." He smiled. "Good. The ones who should be scared are the people who think you're just a waitress." There was a pause. Then Lily asked something soft. "Why me?" Edward leaned back, thoughtful. "Because you listen. You observe. You don't flinch at power. You study it. And you don't need attention to stay grounded." He turned toward her. "And because you remind me of someone." "Who?" "My mother," he said quietly. "She survived Nazi Germany with 2 children and no husband. She cleaned houses during the day and wrote poetry by night. Never raised her voice once. But people remembered her, not because she was loud, but because she was undeniable." Lily's eyes burned. She blinked it back. And then, for the first time that night, she laughed, softly. Edward raised an eyebrow. "What?" "I was just thinking. If Jason knew I'd be sitting here right now, sipping tea in the lounge with the man he spent 7 months trying to impress, he'd probably throw a chair." Edward chuckled. "Let him. And you, listening to this right now, you didn't expect to feel this much, did you? But here you are, still here, still holding on to every word, because maybe something in Lily reminds you of someone too. Someone strong, quiet, unshakable. Maybe you see yourself, and if you do, let this moment be your signal. Subscribe, not because we asked, but because this story matters, because someone out there needs to hear it, and maybe that someone is you." Edward stood slowly, adjusted his coat. "I'll see you in the boardroom soon." Lily stood with him. "You sure about that?" He smiled. "No." He paused at the door. "But I've always preferred uncertain beginnings over predictable endings." He left. And for the first time that night, Lily was truly alone. But it didn't feel lonely. It felt full, like something had just started. Jason wasn't done. He had lost the room, lost the deal, lost the moment. But men like Jason don't retreat, they reconstruct, not because they're brave, but because they're afraid of what it means to be powerless. By morning, the clip was everywhere. A 7-second video, no context, no commentary, just words. "Don't touch me, you stupid black girl." The internet didn't need an explanation. The world didn't want a press release. It wanted a reckoning, and it got one. Sponsors backed out. A keynote was cancelled. 2 board members requested an emergency vote. And Jason put together a plan, a statement, a strategy, a photo. The next day, Lily got a call. It wasn't from the media. It was from Boca's general manager. "Someone's requesting you for a private event. Table of 5, high profile. They said they'll only dine if you're on staff tonight." Lily was already suspicious. "I'm not available," she said flatly. "It's Jason Walsh," the GM said. "He's asking to speak with you in person." Her breath didn't catch. Her hands didn't shake. She just closed her eyes. Of course he was. That evening, against her better judgment, Lily walked into the lounge. Jason stood near the back, wearing a grey suit that looked like it had been steamed 3 times over. The look in his eyes wasn't contrite. It was calculated. "Lily," he said, offering a tight smile. She didn't answer. He gestured toward the seats. "Please, just a few minutes." She stayed standing. He sighed. "Look, I made a mistake. A bad one. I was out of line." She said nothing. "I've issued an apology. I've taken accountability. But I also know that what I said, what happened, affected your career, your name, and I want to help make it right." That's when she knew something was off. He wasn't here to apologize. He was here to leverage. He slid a folder across the table. Inside, a 6-figure offer, spokesperson contract, brand diversity campaign. Terms included press photos, curated interviews, and a signed NDA. Lily stared at the paper, then at him. "You want me to co-sign your comeback?" Jason leaned forward. "I want to give you a platform." She let out the softest laugh. Not amused, disappointed. "I already have one," she said. "It's called my name." He tried again. "You don't understand how this works. The public forgets, forgives, but only if the victim helps them move on. I'm offering you—" She cut him off. "No. You're offering yourself a shortcut." He stiffened. She folded the folder and pushed it back toward him. "I'm not your diversity shield. I'm not your cleanup crew. And I'm definitely not your redemption arc." Jason's face dropped. For a moment he looked human, wounded, exposed. But it didn't last. Because when ego's hurt, it doesn't bleed. It bites. "You think you're untouchable now?" he said, voice tightening. Lily stood still. "I think I'm done letting men like you decide what I'm worth." She turned to leave. But then, his voice, one last time. "Good luck keeping Langston on your side. He's loyal, until he isn't." She stopped, turned halfway. "You're not warning me," she said. "You're projecting." He didn't answer, because she was right. That night, she sat alone in her apartment. Elijah was already asleep. The lights were low. And for the first time in a long time, she doubted herself, not because she questioned her choices, but because she realized what it might cost. Her name was trending. Her face was being dissected on talk shows. People were arguing about her online. She hadn't asked for any of this. She had just stood still. And somehow that had made her famous. She stared at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. "Was it worth it?" she whispered. No answer. Just the city breathing below. The silence in Lily's apartment was heavier than usual, not because the city had stopped moving, but because she had. The noise in her mind was louder than the sirens outside, louder than the notifications on her phone, louder than the world trying to decide who she was without ever knowing her name a week ago. She stood in the kitchen, staring at her phone on the counter. It had been vibrating all day. Journalists, brands, speaking gigs, checks, requests for comment, requests for quotes, requests for forgiveness, for someone else. She hadn't answered any of them, because Lily wasn't interested in being the story. She had always wanted to change the system, not become a headline inside it. On the table sat the folder Jason had given her. She hadn't thrown it away, not because she was considering it, but because she wanted to remember what it looked like when someone offered her money to forget herself. A soft knock at the door, not urgent, not demanding, just there. She hesitated, then opened it. Edward Langston stood on the other side. No driver, no security, just a man with a quiet expression and 2 cups of coffee in hand. "I figured you hadn't slept," he said. She stepped aside. He walked in. They didn't sit at first. They just stood, 2 people carrying different weights, but standing on the same ground. Edward placed the coffee on the counter. "I heard about Jason's offer," he said. She gave a faint nod. "I said no." "I knew you would," he replied, "but I also know what it feels like to carry a decision like that alone." He paused. "Lily, I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him. Why? He didn't answer right away. Then, because the world has enough people who'll disappear the second it gets complicated. I don't want to be another. Lily finally sat. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. Edward placed an envelope in front of her. This is the final draft, he said. Langston Equity Group. Your name will be on the paperwork by morning. Full co-founder rights, no strings, no appearances, no cameras, just your work, your way. She stared at it. After all this, you still want to move forward? He nodded. I didn't start this for Jason. I started it for people who've been silenced, and you just reminded the world what silence can do. She exhaled. It wasn't relief, it was release, the kind that only comes after you've been holding your breath for far too long. I've been asking myself all day, she said quietly, if it was worth it. He looked at her. And, she smiled, for the first time in my life. I'm not asking that for anyone else's sake. Outside, the city was alive. Inside, Lily felt still, not stuck, just grounded. The kind of stillness that comes after a choice has been made, not for applause, not for optics, but for self. And you, watching this, you've stayed with her all this way. You've seen the insult, the silence, the storm, and now the moment where she could choose safety, or keep choosing herself. It would be easy to say nothing, easy to move on, but you know better. So if this story made you feel something, don't leave without doing something. Subscribe, support this space, support this kind of voice, support what happens when someone doesn't flinch in the face of power, because every time a story like this is told, someone else finds the courage to tell their own. Lily stood, walked to the window. The skyline shimmered beneath the night, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel out of reach. It felt like it was waiting for her. 2 weeks later, the seat at the head of the Valaris capital acquisition table sat empty. Jason Walsh was nowhere to be found. He had resigned voluntarily, or so the press release claimed, but everyone knew better. The board had moved swiftly, sponsors withdrew faster, stockholders turned cold. Because a deal worth $4.5 billion had collapsed, not from bad numbers, but from one sentence too honest to ignore. And in his place, seated at the opposite end of the table, calm, confident, composed, was Lily. No uniform, no apron, no tray in hand. Just a woman in a slate-grey suit, almond eyes focused, hands folded neatly in front of her. The nameplate read, Lily Carter, co-founder, Langston Equity Group. Edward sat beside her. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to, because the room already knew. Lily wasn't here to be the face. She was here to lead. The same journalists who once asked, "Who is she?" were now writing headlines that began with her name. The same voices who once dismissed her as just a server were now quoting her market predictions. And the same investors who once underestimated her. They were now sending in proposals, hoping to be on the right side of history this time. But Lily didn't smile for the cameras. She didn't chase applause. She just did the work. Quiet, precise, focused. Because that's who she'd always been. One evening, after a long day of strategy meetings and onboarding calls, Lily walked past Boca. She paused. The lights inside glowed warmly. New faces on the floor. A new maitre d'. But everything else looked the same. She smiled just once, not out of nostalgia, out of recognition. That was the room where her silence first spoke. She stepped inside, asked for a table, alone. They seated her near the back, by the windows. No one recognized her at first. She ordered sparkling water, a seared halibut and nothing else. She sat with herself, and it was enough. Halfway through the meal, a young waitress approached, nervous, eyes wide. "I'm sorry, but are you—" Lily nodded softly. "Yes." The girl exhaled. "You don't know me, but I just want to say thank you for how you handled everything, for not letting it break you." Lily met her eyes. "It almost did." The girl's face fell. "But it didn't," Lily added gently, "and that's what mattered." Later that night, Lily stood by her window again. Same apartment, same view. But everything felt different now, not because the city had changed, but because she had. And you, still here, still watching, you know what this story was about, don't you? It was never about a billionaire. It was never about a spilled glass of wine. It was about the moment a woman chose herself, even when no one else in the room did. It was about dignity in the face of insult, silence that echoed louder than outrage, and the quiet kind of power that doesn't need permission to rise. So before you go, I need to ask you something. Do you believe true power lives in titles, kano, or in truth? Do you believe dignity is louder than damage? Do you believe that real leadership starts with restraint? If the answer is yes, then don't just watch this story, honor it, share it, and subscribe. Because for every Lily there are 100 more still carrying trays, biting tongues, waiting for the world to listen. Let's make sure it does. Lily turns off the light. The city glows outside her window. She's no longer part of the background, she's the story now, and this time, they're listening.